Beyond the Gates spoilers tease that Thomas discovers a secret about Kat in the small hours, a secret that arrives the way most private truths do, slowly, with the intimacy of breath in the dark, and then with the cold clarity of morning light. They had slept in the same bed, not for the first time and not in a way that should have felt unfamiliar, but that night something shifted, a slip of paper folded under her pillow, the scent of a stranger on the scarf she had wrapped around her throat, a soft vibration in her pocket that she had slept through. Thomas had thought at first it was merely a slip in the fabric of their relationship. Everyone has pockets of unexamined life. But as he woke and smelled the faint tang of someone else in the sheets, the possibility hardening in him felt less like suspicion and more like an uninvited truth. What he uncovered after was not melodrama so much as a quiet ledger of choices. Kat had not been hiding a conspiracy. She had been keeping a careful boundary. The secret itself, small, human, and devastating in its own way, was not betrayal in the vulgar sense but the admission of how little pleasure she drew from what should have been the most intimate part of their connection. She slept with Thomas, yes. She made herself available, yes, but there were things she did not tell him, not because she wanted to wound him but because she feared that his reaction would reshape rather than heal them. Thomas had, for his part, believed that the solution to distance was proximity: have dinner, make love, speak kindly, and the gap would mend. He had not understood the quiet calculus of withdrawal Kat had practiced for months. After their brief, faltering reconciliations, Kat taking the first, fragile steps toward amends, Thomas had wanted to do something concrete to show he could be trusted. He could sense how the air between them had been made thin by apologies and what-ifs. He wanted to replace the thinness with something substantive. The blindfold was theater, yes, but it was meant to be tender. He wanted to create a moment so precise that it left no room for doubt. A hotel room, dinner for two, the small ritual of wine poured into glasses that caught the light like promises. He led her by the hand, careful not to show the look of wounding in his eyes, and Kat let herself be guided because she wanted reconciliation as badly as he did. Or thought she did. The hotel room was the sort of place that makes romance look like a film set. The sheets shimmered under the city's reflected neon. A record hums something old and smoky. Candlelight licked at the corners of a room that smelled of jasmine and recently cleaned linen. Thomas had planned everything to the letter. The tablecloth he had folded himself in a nervous, fumbling attempt to be ceremonious. The plate with a meal meant to be both simple and indulgent. A playlist curated to say what words might not. In the brief, bright window before they ate, Kat unwrapped the blindfold and smiled with the old, tentative warmth that suggested there might still be a future. They spoke soft, careful thing-shelf jokes and tentative confessions. She asked him about work and the tone of his voice. He answered and tried to listen like a man unlearning old defenses. They danced. It was the sort of dance that falls between intimacy and rehearsal, two people learning the timing of each other's breath again. Kat moved with a kind of nervous eagerness, twirling in a way that said she wanted to be lighter than she felt. Thomas led, yes, but he also watched every micro-expression the way a man watches a weather forecast when the storm is rumored. The dance ended with a kiss that was meant to seal the moment. But what it sealed was not warmth so much as an awareness that the choreography of their bodies had been practiced without honesty. When Thomas tried to speak plainly later about the tenderness he wanted, the physical closeness that for him functioned as emotional language, Kat's reaction was immediate, not because she wanted to argue but because the subject touched something raw. Thomas had been careful with words at first. He said the things that could be said without prying open closed wounds. He said, gently, that he wanted more than what had been happening, more than the stolen hours and the fragmentation of their nights into practical privacy. He wanted partnership in the fullest sense, which, to him, included a sexual life that felt alive and mutual. He wanted her to meet him there, to say yes in a way that made sense of the loneliness that had been growing between them. Kat recoiled. Not theatrically. There was no dramatic breaking of plates, no scream, but in a way that was telling. A tightening at the corners of her mouth, a quickness to her speech that tried to deflect, an apology preemptive and clumsy. She had always been sensitive, quick to translate a phrase into a verdict about her worth. Her inner critic, drained by years of comparison and of internalized voices from past relationships or roles, turned even the most careful statements into indictments of her own desirability. Tomas watched her misinterpret his patience for condescension, his plea for honesty as a personal failure on her part. She flinched away from the directness he offered because the act of meeting him sexually felt to her like opening a ledger in which she kept all the things she feared were inadequate. Sex for them had become an awkward arithmetic. Tomas, whose affectionate gestures were honest and practical, felt rebuffed by the coolness under Kat's skin. Kat, who had retreated into a practical, non-romantic mode, felt judged and inadequate in ways she could not quite articulate. When she interrupted Tomas mid-sentence with a brittle joke about his prowess, "You're not great in bed, Tomas," she said, thinking perhaps that humor would diffuse the moment. There was a sting that was not merely about skill. That phrase carried 1,000 assumptions, that Tomas believed sex was the only proof of love, that she had to apologize for not performing to some imagined standard. It was both an attempt at self-preservation and a surrendering of her own vulnerability. Tomas's disappointment was not a dramatic thunderbolt. It was quieter and more corrosive. He left the hotel room with a feeling like cold water poured over his chest. He had wanted the night to be an act of repair. Instead, it felt like a mirror put between them that magnified what was missing. He had hoped for mutual desire, for the kind of intimacy where the small edges of fear could be softened by shared insistence. What he found was a gap that made even the air between them seem thin and brittle. When Kat apologized, her voice small, laced with shame, Tomas found he couldn't accept it as the closure he wanted. The apology was necessary, but not sufficient. He needed not only words but evidence of change. He needed Kat to show up in a way that suggested she wanted to be there, not merely that she had agreed to be. Kat sat alone in the dim hotel light after Tomas left, the echo of his footsteps gone like a small, severe absence. She scolded herself for being too blunt, too defensive. She recognized the trace of truth in his expression. He was hurt, yes, but perhaps more than hurt was lonely. And loneliness can polish a man's expectation into a sharp object. Kat listened to the silence the room made and tried to sift through her own feelings without the shielding language of jokes. She thought of earlier times, off the days when their sex had been a part of a whole that included laughter, shared grocery lists, and the easy comfort of evenings spent together. She wondered at when the latter had become the primary scaffolding, and the former a performance required out of duty. Later that night, Tomas walked to a bar that was neither glamorous nor notorious. It was simply the sort of place one goes when their own home feels crowded with questions. The bar smelled of lemon and old wood. A low jazz record hummed behind the hum of glassware. He took a seat at the end of the counter as if positioning himself for anonymity. A few stools down, a woman he knew Eva noticed his face. She had a certain knowledge of Tomas, not because they were intimate in any grand sense, but because she had watched him move through the same social circles, because she was someone who took small risks and read people's loneliness the way others read menus. Eva's approach was casual. She had a knack for entering a room like a question that needed to be answered. She slid onto the stool beside him with the easy charm of a person who knew how to navigate the soft politics of other people's evenings. "You look like you lost something important," she said, not unkindly. Tomas, not in the mood for secrets and spare words, shrugged. He did not tell her about the blindfold, about the dinner, about the way Kat's apology had felt like a bandage on a deeper wound. He merely let the grief be a flat shape inside his chest, something dumb and heavy. Eva, bright and somewhat predatory in the way of people who have learned to use attention as currency, guessed more than Tomas liked. "It's Kat, isn't it?" she asked, voice low. Her eyes were direct, the kind that found seams in people to press and test. Tomas lifted his head in surprise at the accuracy of her guess. "Every time you look like this, it's because of her," she added. That familiarity could have been comforting if Tomas had wanted comfort. Instead, it felt like exposure. He liked Eva in that way one likes a plausible plan. She seemed practical and unafraid of the contours of life that men like Tomas found alarming. She had a reputation for being the sort of person who notices when other people's relationships fray and, more importantly, She had a reputation for walking into the gap. Eva's presence was catalytic. In the telling of his story, brief, jumbled, a mixture of blame and yearning, Tomas began to understand that his expectations had hardened into a sort of ultimatum. Either Kat would rejoin him completely or he would be left holding the memory of a love that could not keep pace with his needs. He said the words aloud that he had been thinking, that he wanted to feel desired, to be seen, to have the physical language of their relationship mean something integral. Eva listened and did not judge the ache. Instead, she offered him something he had not yet allowed himself to consider, that the problem might not be about his inability or his lover's shortcomings, but about a mismatch, a fundamental disconnect in what they needed from intimacy. Eva's guest hat Tomas might find in her company a simpler, more immediate remedy hung between them like an unspoken offer. She did not press, not overtly. She smiled with the kind of warmth that narrowed to a precise focus. If Tomas wanted, she could be there, in a non-judgmental way, to help him find what he was looking for. She referred obliquely to timing and coincidence, to the notion that some interruptions in life are arranged by nothing more than opportunity. Her suggestion was an invitation to test whether desire was a quality that belonged to a person or to a context. The idea of sleeping with Eva was at once repulsive and electric. Tomas felt guilty even considering it, because he knew the moral contours of the choice. If there were promises, children, the fragile architecture of a life that had once felt built to withstand small storms. Yet the thought of moving into a night with Eva, where the pressure of repaired love would be absent and the motivation be simply to move past the loneliness, tempted him like a shortcut. He imagined a night where things could be simple, where there would be no expectation of permanence, where mutual need could be uncomplicated. Eva watched him as if she could read the future of the conversation in the way he tilted his head. There was no plan, she said, but there was a clear offer. You don't have to decide tonight, she added, kindly. You can test the water. See if you're the kind of man who needs something different. Her voice did not shame, it merely framed alternatives. Tomas left the bar with a brain buzzing like a neon sign. The night air felt sharp, and every corner held the possibility of a different life. He walked his streets with the heaviness of someone who has been given a choice that will not feel morally neutral later. He thought of Kat alone in the hotel, of the apology she had pressed into his hands like a small, fragile object, of how intimacy had become the measure by which they judged the worth of their relationship. He also thought of Eva's soft competence and the way she had named what Tomas himself could not, that sometimes two people, no matter how affectionate, are not calibrated to one another's needs. He reached his apartment and did not climb the stairs immediately. The idea of returning to the house where conversations would resume in the morning full of explanations and teary confessions felt like stepping back into a room with drafts. For a moment he considered calling Kat, laying everything out and asking for a new kind of honesty. Instead he found himself paralyzed by the recognition that whatever path he chose now would reshape the map of their days. The possibility that he might go to Eva, that he might seek in her a night that would provide a different kind of solace, hovered like a question mark. Down the street, Kat checked her phone, saw no message, felt the absence of Tomas's voice like pressure at the center of a bruise. She lay in the hotel bed and tried to name what she felt: shame, yes; fear, yes; and at the base of it all, a loneliness that had begun as practical retreat and now felt like exile. She did not know that Tomas was at a bar with Eva, figuring out whether the chemistry he wanted might be found elsewhere. She only knew that the night they had planned as a reconciliation had ended with her alone, thinking and doubting in equal measure. The crossroads they faced was not cinematic in its clarity. It was a slow, narrowing lane of choices, some self-protective and some selfish, each carrying consequences that would ripple outward. Tomas felt the thrum of a possible infidelity, the kind born less of lust than of need, and wondered whether such an act could ever truly reveal the truth about what they were to each other. Kat felt the shrinking of her own desires into a quiet that frightened her. She wondered if she was damaged or simply different. The night held both of them like two ships in a fog, close enough to see the other's silhouette but not close enough to touch without risking collision. Neither of them yet knew which course the night would set them on.